Nobody in Millhaven could explain why Clara Ashford said yes. Not her sister Ruth, who had stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and an expression that asked the question her mouth wouldn't form. Not the women at the Sunday market who spoke about it in the careful, roundabout way of people who want to be seen as concerned rather than curious. And certainly not Clara herself, who had given the answer before she had fully understood what she was agreeing to. She was 24. Her father had been in the ground 11 months. The farm had a roof that argued with every heavy rain, a debt that did not argue with anyone because it did not need to, and a younger brother, Thomas, who was 16 and brilliant in the specific way that requires someone else to keep him fed and enrolled in school. So when Harlan Graves, who owned the mill at the edge of town and had never once in 40 years been described as a warm man, sent word through his lawyer that he was looking for a wife of practical disposition, and would Clara Ashford be willing to meet, she had said yes, not because she wanted to, because the roof was losing the argument. Harlan Graves was 51 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years doing exactly what he intended, and finding it less satisfying than expected. He was not unkind in the obvious ways. He did not raise his voice. He did not speak to people as though they were beneath him, at least not in words. But there was a distance to him, a deliberate, maintained distance. The kind a person builds not from cruelty but from long practice at keeping themselves contained. Clara noticed it the first time they met across the lawyer's desk, the way he kept his hands folded and his face arranged, and his eyes moving slightly to the left of her face rather than directly at it, as though looking at her straight on would cost him something he hadn't budgeted for. She had thought, sitting there in her one good dress, that this was simply how it would be. A practical arrangement between two people who needed different things from each other. She would manage his house. He would keep her family from losing theirs. Whatever either of them had once imagined about marriage could stay quietly where it was, imagined and unspoken. She had been prepared for that. She had not been prepared for the letters. She found them 6 weeks after the wedding, not by searching. Clara Ashford was not a woman who went through other people's things. A fact about herself she considered important. She found them because the bottom drawer of the writing desk in the study had warped in the autumn damp, and she was trying to fix it. And when she pulled it free, a bundle of envelopes came with it. They were tied with a piece of ordinary string. The handwriting on the outside was not Harlan's. It was a woman's hand, slanted slightly left, unhurried. The name on the top envelope was not hers, Eleanor. She set them on the desk. She stood there for a moment with the drawer still in her hands, and then she put the drawer down too and looked at the bundle without touching it again. She was a practical woman. She told herself this regularly, the way a person repeats a useful truth. And practical women did not invent stories about things they did not yet understand. She left the letters where they were and went to make supper. It was Thomas who told her. In the way younger brothers sometimes tell things, not meaning to, not understanding the weight of what they're carrying, simply setting it down in conversation because it had gotten heavy. He had been in town. He had run into old James Petty outside the feed merchant, who had known their father, who had known most people in Millhaven longer than most people cared to remember. He mentioned Eleanor Graves, Thomas said, serving himself a second portion of potatoes without looking up, said it was a shame what happened, said Harlan never really came back from it. Clara set down her fork. Eleanor Graves, his daughter. Thomas looked up then, reading something in her stillness. Did you not know? She died 3 years ago, I think, or 4. He frowned. Petty said she was going to be a teacher, that she'd been accepted to a college in the city. He paused. He said Harlan built the new schoolhouse the following year, paid for the whole thing himself, never told anyone why. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing something businesslike with the last leaves on the oak tree. No, Clara said, I didn't know. She did not ask Harlan about it directly, not that night and not the following day. She was not sure she had the right to yet or the right words. or a clear enough understanding of what she would do with the answer. But she watched him differently. She watched the way he moved through the house in the evenings, with the particular quietness of a man who had long since stopped expecting it to be full of noise. The way he sometimes stopped in the doorway of the room she had quietly rearranged, not dramatically, just the small adjustments a person makes when they're trying to live in a space rather than pass through it, and stood there for a moment with an expression she couldn't read before moving on. She watched the way he was with Thomas, who came to dinner on Sundays now, how he asked the boy specific questions about his schoolwork, how he listened to the answers with more attention than she had expected, how once, when Thomas had been talking about mathematics with the particular excitement of someone who has just understood something beautiful, she had caught Harlan looking at the boy with something in his face that lasted only a second before he rearranged it. Something that looked, beneath its surface, like grief dressed in another coat. One evening she went back to the study. The letters were where she had left them. She picked up the bundle and carried it to his library, where he was sitting with a book he wasn't reading, and set it on the table beside his chair. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "I found them fixing the drawer," she said. "I didn't read them. I won't unless you tell me I should." Harlan's hands rested on the arms of his chair. He was looking at the bundle of letters with an expression Clara now recognized. It was the same expression she had seen in the doorway, the same one he had almost shown at the dinner table. Only now there was no one to rearrange it for. "They're hers," he said. "She wrote them while she was at school." He paused. "I was supposed to visit. I kept having reasons not to." Clara said nothing. "She died before I ran out of reasons," he said quietly. The fire moved in the grate. Somewhere outside, the wind was still working on the oak tree. "I married you," he said after a long silence, "because the lawyer said you were practical and capable and needed a solution. I told myself that was a sufficient basis." He looked up then, directly at her for the first time without the slight sideways drift. "I was wrong to tell myself that. You deserved to know what you were walking into. You deserved more than a solution." Clara looked at him steadily. "And what was I walking into?" "A house full of someone I failed," he said simply. "And a man who has spent 3 years being very busy so he doesn't have to stand still long enough to know what to do about it." She did not tell him it was fine. It wasn't, entirely. She had agreed to a practical arrangement and found herself in the middle of a grief she hadn't known existed, in a house carrying the shape of a girl she would never meet. That was not nothing. That required more than a single evening by a fire to understand. But Clara Ashford had grown up learning that the hardest things were rarely the things that announced themselves. They were the things you found when you pulled a stuck drawer free. The things a person had been carefully keeping out of sight because they had run out of better ideas. She was a practical woman. She understood stuck drawers. "Tell me about her," she said. Harlan looked at her as though she had offered him something he had not known he was allowed to accept. "Eleanor," he said, and then, slowly, in the way of a man opening something that has been closed a long time, he did. It did not fix everything at once. Good things rarely do in a place like Millhaven, but the house changed. Slowly, in ways that were difficult to point to directly. The distance Harlan carried did not disappear, but it became something less deliberate, less maintained. He still kept his hands folded in the evenings, but sometimes he forgot to keep his face arranged, and on those occasions Clara discovered that the expressions underneath were not cold at all, only careful. The way a person is careful with something they have dropped once, and are not sure they could afford to drop again. By the following spring, he had told the school board she would be joining the reading committee. He had not asked her first. When she raised an eyebrow, he said, without any particular expression, "Eleanor thought the library was inadequate. I expect you will too." He was right. By summer, Thomas had a standing invitation to Sunday dinner and a small account at the stationer's, opened quietly, that no one mentioned directly. By the autumn of the second year, Clara Ashford, Clara Graves, though she was still sometimes surprised by the name, understood that she had not married a cold man. She had married a man in the process of finding out whether warmth was still available to him, and she had, without entirely meaning to, become part of the answer. The schoolhouse at the edge of town had Eleanor's name on a small plaque near the door. Clara read it every time she passed. She thought that a girl who had wanted to be a teacher would have found something fitting in that. She hoped so. She thought, on balance, that she was right. And so ends the story of Clara and Harlan, two people who discovered that practical arrangements have a way of becoming something else entirely when both people inside them are honest enough to say what they actually found. If stories like this one stay with you after the last word, there are more waiting. Each one is different. Each one is worth the time.